Now, I'm very excited to hear from our industry expert, John Elliott, who is a data protection specialist helping global organizations create and execute meaningful security strategies. So John, with that, I'm going to let you take it from here.
Great. Thank you very much, Andrew. And good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending where you are in the world. As Andrew said, my name is John Elliott. I do two things. I do Pluralsight courses because I love teaching people about information security and cybersecurity, and I'm a day-to-day practitioner. Before I start, a couple of really important things that I have to say, which is this: that number one, these are my own personal thoughts. They're not Pluralsight's. They're not my employers either, and by the very nature of a general webinar, I'm going to make some generalizations. And you might say, well, that's not like us in our organization. I know that there are some generalizations in here, but hopefully there are some things that are like you and there'll be some benefit in it. And in terms of who I think I'm talking to today, I'm assuming that we've got a large number of information technology or information security professionals here, but also a lot of learning development professionals. And so I've tried to pitch the content somewhere in the middle, because to do really good awareness training requires both types of people to work really closely hand in hand. So, because from an information security perspective, we're not always the best people to be able to work out exactly how to get our message across. And learning development people don't always know what right questions to ask us in information security to produce great awareness training. So hopefully, as we're coming up to Cybersecurity Awareness Month next month, this will be of some help in developing messaging and developing what you want to be talking to your organization about. So I talk about the new normal, and that's a horrible phrase we hear at the moment, isn't it? Everything is the new normal. But, you know, we have got a new normal in cybersecurity, not a pandemic, but an endemic. Cyber attacks are endemic now. It's not just an occasional thing. They're happening all over the time. We just need to read the press. This ransomware and stealing your data attack that we saw Carlson Wagon Lee Travel have, a lot of US cities, Garmin, is a really popular attack, and it's really popular because the criminals are making money from it. So it's not going to go away. And when I started in cybersecurity, you know, it wasn't every single business sector that we had to worry about. But nowadays, it's cross-sectoral. It's state government, it's city government, it's airports, it's all sorts of organizations. So I think that's a change. That's the new normal for us. We see business email compromise continuing to be a very profitable, gosh knows why, but it still is a very profitable activity for criminals. And we've now got a more remote workforce. Some people are starting to go back to the office, which means that a lot of the time people haven't got the ability to just ask a colleague sitting next to them, like, I received this email, it looks a bit fishy, what do you think? Because you won't typically do that on Teams or Slack or whatever it is that people use to communicate. So we've lost a lot of that informality. So, you know, let's work out what awareness is. Awareness, by the dictionary, says it's knowledge or perception of a situation or fact. So when we talk about cybersecurity awareness, what knowledge or perceptions are we trying to teach about situations or facts? And I'm going to really cover three things today. I'm going to talk about who needs awareness. Is it just security awareness that's needed, or is it something else? And at what depth do we need to get that awareness to? And I'm going to do that for really four groups of people. The first is everyone in the organization who have accidents, and they make, you know, people who make what I call small security related decisions. The second group of people are change makers, people who do business change. What I mean by that is both the executives that initiate and control business change and support business change, but also the people in the organization who actually make business change happen. So program managers, project managers, people are responsible for making that change happen. And then thirdly, people who are actually responsible for running controls. So people in HR, in facilities and information technology, whose day-to-day job means they run information security controls. And then finally, awareness for the information and cybersecurity teams, whose job it is to do cybersecurity and information security every day, but they still probably need some awareness as well. I am going to spend 80% of this webinar talking about everyone. And then at the end, I'm just going to talk about the awareness, that knowledge of situations and facts that's going to be really handy for those other four groups. And a lot of this comes from two things. One is I've had to, because I work as an interim quite frequently, do a lot of mandatory awareness training. And because I work as an information security trainer, I've actually given or developed a lot of awareness training. So it comes from those two backgrounds. And I see a lot of it's being compliance driven. There tends to be awareness training that's very shallow, so not very deep, but across a wide range of subjects, without a real focus on what in training and development we talk about as being learning outcomes. what I mean by that is that when I'm asked to do awareness training, the question I ask is, well, what will the person be able to do after they've done the awareness training that they couldn't do before? You know, and you get basically answers like this as well. I'd like to be more aware. It's like, well, okay, well, what does more aware look like? What would they do differently? It's like, well, they'd be more security conscious. It's like, okay, but what does security conscious mean? What would they do differently? And you know, I get an answer like, well, they wouldn't do dangerous things. Like, well, what sort of dangerous things? Then it's also, well, but they wouldn't if they got sent a USB drive in the post, they wouldn't, or found it in the car park or the elevator, they wouldn't put it into their computer. It's like, okay, so what you're saying is you want your users to become a better security control. In other words, you want them to, if they get sent a USB drive in the post, not to insert it into a computer. So if we're asking to be a better security control, what sort of security control do we want to be? Do we want one that protects the organization or alerts the organization that something fishy is going on? And so, and one thing I like to do nowadays is I like to write these things as user stories, just as if we were doing some agile programming. So my user story for this is, as an information security manager, I want a user who receives a USB drive in the post not to insert it into their computer. And that's a plausible user story. And you might be thinking, John, this is quite an old attack, but it's still an attack, okay? And I'm picking it because it's a simple example. The problem with this is that by just not inserting it into a computer, what do they do with it? Do they leave it lying around the office? Because a USB drive lying around in an office or in a drawer is a bit like a gun in a play. At some time, if there's a gun in a play, it's going to be go off, right? And if there's a USB drive hanging around your office, someday someone's going to pick it up and go, I wonder what this USB drive does, and stick it into a computer. So maybe we say, as an information security manager, I want a user who receives a USB drive in the post to put it into the trash. And that's good, but then as the information security manager, I don't know that people are dropping USB drives outside my office and in the car park or sending them in the post and hoping to compromise my system. So maybe a better thing is to say, as an information security manager, I want a user who receives a USB drive in the post to send it to information security in the mail. And you see the differences here is, this is something, here we start off with basically a negative, something I don't want someone to do, and that's poor to train. It's hard to train people not to do some things. There's a natural tendency of people to not focus on the not. So if I say to you all, don't think of a orange elephant, you're probably thinking of an orange elephant, right? Here's a slightly more positive. I want to put it in the trash. And here's very positive, because we're asking to do something positive that we can also reinforce. And what I've tend to find is it's much easier to teach humans to be detective controls, i.e. tell us about something, rather than being protective controls, just don't do something. So if I describe that in learning outcomes, and when we build training courses at Pluralsight, we're always talking about learning outcomes, terminal learning outcomes, which is the sort of end thing, and then enabling learning outcomes, which enable the terminal learning outcome to happen. And so, you know, if our terminal learning outcome is we want people to be able to send to people who receive a USB drive in the post to send it to the information security team, you know, there's 4 things they need to be able to do. They need to be able to understand that that's an attack, which is why we're asking them to do these things. They need to know how to recognize a USB drive. Again, pretty simple, but we need to get that step in there. They need to be able to explain what to do if they or a colleague receives a USB drive in the post or finds it in the car park or the lift. And then they need to know how to send it on to the information security team. So 2 of those things are skills, aren't they? So actually we require some skills training here. So it's the skill of being able to recognize a USB drive. Pretty simple, I know, but if this was recognize a phishing email, that would be a whole different set of skills. And there's the skill of what to do. And then we've got a couple of bits of knowledge of situations or fact, in other words, awareness. And those 2 things are awareness, they're different awareness. The first awareness is a contextual awareness about understanding the context of what we're asking people to do. And the second is a process awareness, an understanding of the what to do. And if we think, well, we've got those 4 enabling objectives, if we lay them out, it's actually quite a linear story here. We've got a story we can tell about how an attacker thinks they're going to get into an organization by sending these USB drives in the post. We get a story about people receiving them and recognizing them and going, oh, it's a USB drive. I know what to do with that. And then sending it on to information security team. And having a narrative is really great from a training perspective. At Pluralsight, if you've taken any of our courses, you'll often hear there's a story narrative running through it. And that's really deliberate, because good instructional design has a story narrative to what you're trying to teach, because people can really get to grips with a story. They memorize things that are taught as stories much more than they memorize things that are taught as facts. So whenever we're doing training and awareness training, if you can build a story narrative, it makes it much more sticky. The other thing we need to do is also to work out what level we want someone to learn something at. And at Pluralsight, we use this revised Bloom's taxonomy, which sounds like something really quite exciting, but actually isn't. Basically saying, what level do we want someone to learn something at? Do we want them to be able to have knowledge of it so they can recall something, like learning the times table, or the list of presidents in the American state, or what's the state bird of North Carolina, that type of learning? Or do we want the learning that is an understanding learning, where they can explain what they've learned to you? Or do you want them to apply the facts and the concepts and the techniques to their work environment? Or finally, do you want them to be able to take those facts and concepts and techniques and apply and analyze a novel situation and apply those things to that novel situation and synthesize something new? And if we look, because they're all different levels of learning, and if we look at our terminal and enabling learning objectives, we probably want them, they're probably at the application and the understanding level. The understanding level is where we're at effectively for the awareness training, and then the application level is where we're at for the skills training. And that eventually gives us an application level of being able to say, oh, there's a USB drive in the post. I recognize that. I now know what to do with it. That actually is quite a generic form for many things we want to teach in awareness training. Is there's a balance of awareness training, of contextual awareness and action and process awareness. There's a balance of skills of how to recognize something and what to do about it. But both are all not the reciting facts, but a lot of awareness training just is like a machine gun of facts. So my first takeaway from today is, when you're building awareness training, be really careful to define your terminal and your enabling objectives, and then put the required skill levels there. And those skill levels are really important, because it's a lot more effort from both the trainer's perspective and the learner's perspective to be able to get to the level of doing application or analysis type skills that it is for knowledge type skills. And knowledge type skills are unfortunately not what we need when we're doing security training. Another thing I'd like to mention is that this level of analysis, this ability to have lots of facts and techniques and knowledge and be able to synthesize those, is the level that most of us working in information security are at, right? So we can look at an email and go, that's a phishing email. We can look at a new business opportunity and highlight the risks and opportunities in there. Right? But that's because we've been doing that for a number of months or years. But you do not get that level of ability to do analysis, of seeing something novel and being able to synthesize the fact that that's a threat and do some threat recognition after 60 or 30 minutes awareness training. And unfortunately, I've seen a lot of awareness training, or have been asked to provide a lot of awareness training with that expectation. And so my second takeaway today is this, is that it's actually unreasonable to expect non-information security professionals to be able to recognize novel attacks, given lots of awareness training. They just won't get to that level. Now, we might want them to, in which case we need to do a whole lot more training and a whole lot more reinforcement. And we almost need to turn them into information security people, which might not be cost effective for us. So we don't want to go to awareness training with the expectation we can teach lots of awareness about the stuff we know, that scattergun approach to, well, here are all the threats and here are all the attacks, and this is what you might see and this is what you might not see, to be able to recognize a novel attack. So those are my first two takeaways. The next question I want to address is do humans make good security controls? So which is better, a human or a technical system? And there's a lot of academic research done on how good humans are at security controls. And generally, the first thing to notice is that most people come to work to perform their primary task. So they might come to work because they are a field marketing manager, or an accountant, or a solicitor, or a cashier in a restaurant, or a person in a contact center, or a manager of someone in a contact center, or they might be a business strategist, but they come to work to do that type of thing. anything we ask them to do related to security are secondary tasks, and they're secondary in so many ways. So although we'd like people maybe to be, much better at doing security tasks we ask them to do after having awareness training, we have to realize that that's what we would like, but it's not exactly what's going to happen, because people come to work and they're rewarded to do their primary tasks. The second thing we get from academic research is that people have a compliance budget. They are prepared to give us some of their brain space and their time and their thinking and their doing to do the security compliance things we ask them to do with, right? But they only have a small budget for that. And one thing that's really important for us to recognize is that if we ask them to do too many things, they'll be selective about choosing which things fit into their compliance budget. So if their compliance budget is, I'll remember and do 5 things diligently, but we ask them to do 10 things diligently, they'll pick and choose the 5 things that they want to do. And also, if those 5 things actually take more of their budget, they might then start adapting what we have asked them to do and do things in a slightly different way so it fits in with our supply, with their compliance budget. So as well as people having a compliance budget, they're not great at security controls. There's probably 50 or 60 academic papers you can search for that have tested this. I've cited 2 here. The Cormac-Hurley paper is a brilliant one. Yeah, they either reject the advice we give them, or they just don't do what we expect of them. And that's generally true for up to, between 25 and 50% of users. And so if you do some searching of this and read the academic research of it, you realize that the last thing we really want to do is make people into security controls. And so if I summarize this, human security is not their primary task. They don't have a massive capacity for doing it. We can't really get any metrics on how well they do unless we test them with things that are not security things, that are like sending them testing phishing emails. And then we can say, oh yeah, we managed to train them to be really good at it. But that doesn't work out when it comes to real ones. They've got very variable behavior. If they're stressed or if their boss is giving them a hard time about a deadline, they're not very predictable in how they do it. Whereas technical systems are predictable and they're reliable and they're repeatable. And humans are expensive. The more we ask people to stop doing their day job and do security, the less they're doing their day job, which is what we get them paid into. And one of the best examples I have of this is phishing. And we say, and lots of people still in security will hear say, don't click on links in phishing emails. Well, don't click on links is not a great thing to say in 2020. In the new normal of where we are today, our digital life entails clicking on links. I'm going to hazard a guess you all clicked on a link to join this webinar. I know I did click on a link to join this webinar. In the olden days, we used to send people, like 2-3 years ago, we used to send people attachments. Nowadays, we sent them links to online documents in SharePoint or in Google Docs or in Teams. Our life is link-based more than anything else. So saying don't click on links, it's quite a hard starting place. You say, well, no, that's not what I mean, John. What I mean is that if everyone does all these things, they look for spelling mistakes, they look at the full email headers, and they hover their little mouse over the link and read what it actually says, and they look at the sender's address to see if it's been forged. I mean, those are all things that we in information security find really easy to do because we've been doing it for a long time. Teaching those are fairly high-level skills. So if you wanted us to teach that, that's a lot of teaching and then repetition and then reinforcement. And so if you look at something like the National and I appreciate this is the United Kingdom National Cybersecurity Centre, which I hope you forgive me for because I'm from the UK, so that tends to be my references, but I'm sure the NIST guidance is pretty similar. But the NCSC guidance is like, number 1, make it really hard for attackers to get their phishing emails through to your users. And then number 2, teach the users to be detective controls by reporting those phishing emails. And if you're really clever, your system will then take those reports and make its learning of phishing emails much better. And there's a great case study on the NCSC website, and the URL's there, of an actual phishing campaign that happened to a financial services company. Of 1,800 emails were sent. But only 50 of them got to people's inboxes, and then only 25 of them were reported. So that's really good. So 25 emails were reported. So that's 50% of the ones that landed in inboxes, and then 14 of them actually, and this is where humans are not great security controls, 14 of them were clicked and opened. And so, as we see, the more we stop the email coming into somebody's inbox, absolutely the better, because that's going to cut down the number of people who open them or who fail to report them. And if we look at the cognitive levels of that, again, we're into that model again of we need the understanding we can do through awareness training, but the skills of being able to recognize a phishing email and knowing what to do with it are quite high level application and analysis skills. So the way we teach this at Pluralsight, we've got a general awareness course. As we say to the users, there are hundreds and thousands of phishing emails sent every day. There are lots of systems that information security and information technology run to clean that email up so that only the clean ones get through to you. But we know that, a couple will get through to you, and that's when you need to be our eyes and ears and report them to us, i.e. you're the detective control. So my third bit of learning really is that systems are better security controls than humans. And so if you can get a system to do it, given that your humans will only have a very limited compliance budget, if you can take away something you want the humans to do by getting the system to do it, then that's going to be far much better. So the next question I'm going to ask is, well, what should you include in your awareness training? And this is some great research that was done that found about, about 240 bits of information security advice. It wasn't taken from it wasn't taken by analyzing lots of companies' awareness training, but by analyzing lots of security advice aimed at end users the researchers took, and they did some analysis of it. They picked, and I'm just showing the first, 20 or 30 here, but they found about 240 separate different bits of security advice. Now, here's the really interesting bit. They got 41 security experts, people who've been working in information security for a long time, and said, okay, of those 240 bits of advice, is it sensible advice? And basically, yeah, 89% of the advice in the corpus was accurate. But then they said to the information security professionals, pick your top 5. Pick the 5 things that they'd recommend to users. And amongst 41 people, they got 118 things that are in the top 5. So that's really hard. And so the answer is, well, we can't teach those 118 things because people have that compliance budget that we've talked about before. And so the most important thing we need to do is to prioritize what we put in our awareness training. Remember, if we think that people have got a compliance budget of 5 things, so how do we prioritize? And really clearly, how does it relate to the threat environment today and that you see for the next 12 months in your organization? Which where I've been a CISO recently, that's been emails, credential phishing for credentials by email, phishing emails, business email compromise, and then increasingly social engineering, so vishing for multi-factor authentication tokens. And then, can those things that we're thinking of in putting in our awareness thing, can they be done by a system? So we're not trying to teach our users to do it, because the fewer things we teach our users, the better, the more depth you can go into train in your training, and the greater retention you're going to have. So my next takeaway, and I've lost count of the takeaways, I think this is my 4th takeaway, is to really limit the number of terminal objectives. I know it's really, and I've done this myself when I've been thinking, what do I put into awareness training? Well, I need to have that, and I must have that, and I must have that. The more things you teach, the more things you put in your awareness training, the less effective it's going to be. And if effectiveness is what we're after, that's not the way we want to do it. The next question then is, well, why do users reject security advice or not do the things we ask them to do? And again, looking at the academic research, one of the key reasons is the user said, well, the information you gave me made no sense for me. You told me not to do something, but it didn't make any sense to me why you were telling me that. And the second thing is, well, why did you just reject it out of hand? Was 2 things. Number one is it was inconvenient for me to do. It took me too much time. It stopped me doing my primary task. Well, secondly, nothing bad's ever happened before, so I don't see why I should have to do that, which is, again, that's an awareness thing. That's a contextual thing. So my next takeaway, the 5th thing, is that when we do awareness training, we have to provide context, not just skills and behaviors. We have to provide the context so that someone can say, well, the information made sense to me because I understand that people attack us by leaving USB drives with malware sitting in the company car park. or that I understand people attack us for my credentials by sending me emails that get me to click on links that give my credentials away. So people have to understand that that is an attack method that the organization is suffering. And the second thing is nothing's bad happened before. In other words, nothing's bad happened to me and nothing's bad happened to anyone I know. So we have to pick things from the news that people may have seen and said, you know, this thing you heard about, this Equifax thing you heard about, this Anthem thing you heard about, this airport you heard about, this state or city government you heard about. That was how this started. It started because somebody opened a phishing email and they gave away their credentials, and then the attacker was able to do X and Y, so they can put themselves in the, oh, I see that thing has happened before. And when we talk about it being inconvenient, that just means we've got poor security usability. And again, I talk about the new normal because maybe 5 or 6 years ago, this wasn't the case, is that security usability is massively important. And the reason for that is people spend as much time on leisure use of technology, their own personal devices, their computers, their tablets. They spend as much time using those as they do now using work technology. And when I started in the industry, that certainly wasn't the case. Even 10 years ago, that wasn't the case. 5 years ago, that wasn't the case. But now people use technology in the home and in leisure activities and educational activities in their family, as much time doing that as they do at work. And so they're now used to what Wendy Nader calls a consumer-grade experience for how security works. They're using Gmail. They're using some really new, and I'm going to take some old banks out there, but they're using new challenger banks and challenger fintech companies where the security experience is so well integrated into their mobile device, and then we ask them to do something clunky at work. So first of all, we need to make our security usable. And unfortunately, that means we have to emulate what the Googles and the Apples and the fintechs are doing, so our security is usable and not rejected because it's inconvenient. And that secondly, if we're asking people to do things that have got security associated with them, we're giving them the right tools. And what I mean, here's a good example of that. If we don't have single sign-on in our organization, if we ask our users to log into 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 different systems, right? And they have to have a separate username and a password for each of those systems, they're going to write those usernames and passwords down. I mean, we could wish they worked, we could pray they worked, we could hope they worked, we could stand on one leg and do something karmic to make sure it didn't happen, but they're going to write those passwords down because we're putting them in a situation where they have to do that, or they're going to use the same password for all 7 things. So if that's the environment we're in, we have to give them a password manager and teach them the skill of how to use a password manager. And that's not awareness training. Here is an application. You have to be skilled in using it. So if I'm going to sum up the takeaways for general user awareness training, firstly, it's that it's much easier to teach and much more successful if we're teaching humans to be detective controls, see something and tell us about it, rather than just being pure don't do this protective controls. When we're defining awareness training, be really clear. So InfoSec people work with the L&D team to define terminal enabling objectives and then set the skill levels for those terminal and enabling objectives. A general thing for InfoSec people, it's not reasonable to expect people to spot novel attacks. Don't try and train it unless you're prepared to put a lot of time and effort and you've got that budget for doing that time and effort. If you can use the system to be a security control rather than a human, then use the system, because then you can fill your compliance budget with the things that only humans can do. So limit the number of terminal objectives so the humans don't have that much to do. And when you're doing the awareness training, provide that context so that people say, it made sense to me, and don't provide fear because that doesn't work. And then design very usable security rather than non-usable security. So those are the general users. I promised to talk about awareness for 3 other groups of users. But before I do that, let me sum this up with a picture. And the picture is this, that good security has a few topics to a reasonable depth of learning. That gives you good awareness training. Poor awareness training and compliance-driven awareness training has lots of topics to a very shallow depth. So let's talk about other people who need awareness training. And the first thing is change makers. And these are everything from senior executives who initiate change to the middle level people who run and manage the change from a business perspective, product owners, service owners, and then the people in change, in your change function, who make change happen. And so if I take this as a user story, as an information security manager or a CISO, I want people who initiate or manage business change to consult with me and my team so we can ensure that's secure and compliant. I mean, that's particularly what we want. And if I was to try and put that into learning outcomes, well, then I've got a learning outcome that I want people to understand the effects of business change on security, which means there's two things. Like, I want to understand how attackers take advantage of vulnerabilities that are introduced through change, and probably how quickly an attacker takes advantage of a vulnerability that's introduced through change. And then secondly, I want to be able to explain the company's procedures as it relates to information security in change. So, you know, what we've got there is the awareness of the context, i.e. if we put change in and say we'll do the security afterwards, we'll probably be attacked before we put the security in. And secondly, what is it that I should be doing? And again, if we look at the levels of that, that's those are two understanding levels to give us that application level at the terminal objective. Secondly, people who run controls. So people in information technology who maybe build computers or patch computers or run the help desk that reset passwords. And then people in HR who might do screening of new employees. And then people in facilities who manage some physical security. So as the information security manager, I want people who have day-to-day responsibility for operating controls as part of their day job, really to do it properly. But more important, to tell me when that control that I expect to be in place is not in place because it's stopped working for whatever reason. And so if I put that into learning outcomes, I'm going to say, well, what I want there is for somebody to be able to understand the effects of a control failure on security, which means in terms of awareness, I want them to understand how attackers attack, and again, how quickly an attacker will take advantage of a control failing and exploit a vulnerability. Because, you know, a lot of general users don't have a lot of general people who are responsible for controls think, well, it'll be okay if I fix it in a couple of days, not realizing that we're constantly, as an organization, perhaps we're constantly being probed by attackers. And then secondly, to make sure that they can follow the process that they have to follow in the event of a control not functioning. And maybe you don't have a process for, I'm sorry, my control's not functioning, how do I tell you about it? So you find that out early. And then the skill, obviously, of doing their day job. But from an awareness perspective, we've got those two awareness points there. And I'm pointing to my screen, so I know that's not particularly helpful for you. So those two awareness points of the context of why it's important the controls running 7x24. And then secondly, the awareness of the process of what to do in the organization. So that's people who make change happen, and then people who are responsible for day-to-day running controls have some awareness needs that are separate from the general awareness. And then finally, the informational cybersecurity team actually need context to do their jobs, or I should say we need context to do our jobs. And that sometimes that's missing because we need to be able to keep up with the technology stack at the organization. And that's nowadays, that's cloud, that's containers, that's DevOps and continuous deployment. You know, even 5 or 6 years ago, if I said to you, yeah, what we're going to do is we're going to write some code, and then we're going to deploy that code straight into somebody else's environment, and whenever whenever it needs to run, the code will be spun up, it'll be compiled, it will run, it'll execute, and then it'll go. But we have no idea what platform it's running on. I mean, people would say, well, that's quite like science fiction, but that's the new normal. And if you haven't got your InfoSec and cybersecurity teams understanding how all that works at a general level, not at the level to be able to build AWS or Azure instances, not the level to be able to be an AWS or an Azure or a GCP architect, but to understand the new architectural paradigm, they're going to be stuck when you ask them security questions about it. Now, the great thing is that Pluralsight's got all that information there, and it costs you nothing to say to your InfoSec team, hey, I want you to do Azure architecture this week. I'd like to learn the basics concepts of an Azure architecture, because the library's there and there for you to do that. But you need to make sure that's in people's personal development plans, and just not assume that that new IT platform will sort of, you know, osmosis its way into your information security and cybersecurity teams. Because without the really good understanding of how this works, they're going to be making poor decisions based on incomplete knowledge. So that's a different type of awareness training that the InfoSec professionals need. So we've got four types of people who all need awareness training. Everyone needs general awareness training of context and process. People who do change and people in IT, HR, and facilities who run controls need to understand the context of the threat environment at the moment, that it's not okay usually to go and fix something in a couple of days or a week or 2 weeks. You know, we've all heard, well, we'll go live because we promised we need to go live and we'll fix the security later. That just doesn't work anymore. And then your information and cybersecurity teams, they need that context because the world is moving. So my key takeaways are this, you know, number one, you know, define what you want each group of learners to be able to do. And when we talk about awareness, be very clear, we're teaching two things. We're teaching context and we're teaching process in the organization. Otherwise, we're teaching skills and behaviors. And often we want in awareness training, we actually want all four of those things. That those mythical application and analysis skills that often in InfoSec we'd like our end user community to be able to demonstrate, they don't come after an hour of 1 hour a year of training. And if there's nothing else you take away from today, it's that general users have a very limited compliance budget. If you overfill that compliance budget, they will pick and choose what they do. So just give them the right number of things that they'll fit in their compliance budget. The easier you make it, the less that's going to take time from their budget. 5 easy tasks is better than 1 complicated task. That context is really important for people who have day-to-day control responsibility because they don't understand the threat environment typically in the way that we do, and they make risk decisions that are not reflective of the threat environment. So we need to, the awareness training we need to do is, what's the current threat environment? How does that look at our organization? And then finally, a plea for all my fellow InfoSec professionals is that we need the context, the awareness of the new technology stacks we're being asked to secure and provide risk advice about. And that's me done. Thank you. I hope there was something for everyone in there.